The unlikely encounter. Jay Williams had always found peace in the early hours of the morning. Before the world woke up, before the noise of the day could drown out his thoughts, he could lose himself in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. He wasn't a standout athlete or the fastest kid on the block, but there was something meditative about running that made it his refuge. For a few miles each day, he didn't think about the struggles of his family or the limitations of his life. It was just him, his breath, and the road. At 17, Jay was still trying to figure out his place in the world. He was raised in a neighborhood that many people tried to forget. His father worked long hours as a construction worker, barely scraping by to provide for the family. His mother did her best to stretch every penny and keep their small house running smoothly, but it was clear that life had not dealt them an easy hand. Jay often thought about how different life might be if he wasn't living in the cramped, noisy apartment complex where he had spent his entire life. But he knew that dreaming about a better life wouldn't change his circumstances. He had to work for it. And so, every morning at the crack of dawn, he laced up his shoes and hit the streets to run. His routine was predictable. He'd jog through the same quiet, empty streets, past the old brick buildings that looked as though they might crumble under the weight of history. It was a far cry from the bustling city center with its skyscrapers and luxury apartments. Jay never went near the city's pristine areas. He didn't belong there. He had come to accept it. But today was different. As Jay jogged through his usual route, the silence seemed heavier than usual, as though the morning itself was holding its breath. He moved past the same old gas station and the small corner shop where he bought breakfast for his family after his run. Everything was routine, until he saw him. Lying in the middle of the road, sprawled on his back, was a man. Jay skidded to a halt, his heart pounding in his chest. The man was well dressed in an expensive suit, his shoes gleaming despite the grime of the street. He was middle-aged, around 50, with graying hair and a face that seemed to carry the weight of years. But it wasn't the man's appearance that caught Jay's attention, it was the fact that he was lying motionless on the pavement, his chest barely moving. Jay's initial instinct was to keep running. He didn't know this man, and he wasn't sure what had happened. But something in the pit of his stomach told him this wasn't something he could ignore. He stopped, his feet rooted to the ground as he stared at the stranger. "Hey," Jay called cautiously, stepping forward, his voice unsure. "Are you okay?" There was no response. The man's chest rose and fell slowly, but he didn't stir. Jay felt a pang of worry. He approached cautiously, kneeling down beside the man. His hand hovered near the man's shoulder, but Jay hesitated. He didn't know this person, and he didn't want to make things worse. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Jay asked more firmly, his voice shaking slightly. The man's eyes flickered open, but only briefly. His lips parted in a desperate gasp, and he whispered something that Jay barely caught. "Help me. I can't breathe." Jay's heart nearly stopped. The words hit him like a ton of bricks. He knew what this meant. His mind raced for a moment, then focused back on the man in front of him. He had to help, he couldn't just walk away. Without thinking, Jay dropped to his knees and placed his hands on the man's chest, positioning himself for CPR. His hands shook as he pressed down, his palms trembling from the panic setting in. He had taken a first aid course once, but in a real emergency, he wasn't sure if he could remember everything. His breaths came in ragged bursts as he pushed hard and fast, his heart hammering in his chest. "Come on," Jay whispered through clenched teeth, hoping that his actions would make a difference. He could feel the man's heartbeat, faint but still there, and it gave him some hope. "Stay with me. Please." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every time he compressed the man's chest, Jay felt like he was fighting time itself. He wasn't a doctor, and he had no idea if he was doing it right, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't give up. The man's life was in his hands, and Jay wasn't about to let him slip away. Suddenly, the sound of a siren pierced the air, and Jay froze, his heart racing with a strange mix of relief and dread. Help was finally on the way. But as he turned his head to see a police car screeching to a halt just a few feet away, his relief quickly turned to confusion. The officer who stepped out of the car was a middle-aged white man, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable. The officer didn't even glance at the man lying unconscious on the road. His eyes were focused entirely on Jay, and in that moment, a cold chill ran through Jay's spine. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice flat, but with an edge that made Jay uneasy. I was just helping him," Jay stammered, pointing to the man lying on the ground. He collapsed. "I'm trying to save him. Please, help him." But instead of rushing to the man's side, the officer seemed to pause. His eyes narrowed as he sized up Jay, his gaze lingering on the teenager's face. Jay's stomach twisted into knots under that gaze. Something about this felt wrong. The officer took a few steps forward, then his hand instinctively moved toward his belt, where he rested it over his holstered gun. "Why don't you step back, kid?" he said in a low, cold voice. "Let the professionals handle this." Jay's confusion only grew. "I was helping him," he repeated, his voice now louder, a hint of desperation creeping in. "I didn't do anything wrong." But before he could explain further, the officer was pulling out his radio, his words a blur as he spoke into it. "We need backup. We've got a situation here." Jay's chest tightened as the officer ignored him completely, his attention fixed on the unconscious man. For a brief moment, Jay wondered if he was being treated like a criminal for something he hadn't done. The officer's cold demeanor was unnerving, and Jay couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. In the distance, another siren wailed, and a second officer arrived, a younger man in his 30s. He seemed just as unfazed by the scene. Without warning, the first officer stepped back, and to Jay's horror, he was suddenly grabbed by the arms. "You're under arrest," the officer snapped, his voice cold and impersonal. Jay's mind froze. "What? No, please. I was just trying to save him. I swear." But the officer didn't listen. He forcefully cuffed Jay's hands behind his back, yanking him toward the police car. Jay's mind spun in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. He had just been trying to help. How could they arrest him for that? "Please. You don't understand." Jay cried, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The second officer started the engine of the patrol car, and with a final, chilling glance, the first officer slammed the door shut, and the car sped off, leaving Jay in a haze of fear and confusion. As the car rumbled down the road, Jay's mind raced with 1,000 questions. What had gone wrong? How had his life gone from saving someone to being dragged into the back of a police car, accused of something he hadn't done? The sound of the police car's engine was deafening as it carried him away from the only life he knew. But what was waiting for him at the station? Would anyone believe him? Would anyone listen to his side of the story? As the police car sped toward the station, Jay could feel his hope slipping away, the fear growing in his chest. The streets he had known his whole life were now unfamiliar, and Jay had no idea what was coming next. The cold ride. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. The cramped back seat of the patrol car seemed to close in on Jay, his thoughts spiraling in a vortex of confusion and fear. His arms were still handcuffed, the cold metal biting into his wrists with every movement. His heart raced as the car rumbled through the streets, the steady hum of the engine filling the silence between the officers and him. Jay tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man, the well-dressed stranger, had collapsed on the road. Jay had been trying to help, had been giving him CPR, doing everything he could to save his life. Yet, somehow, he was the one being dragged away. He hadn't even been given a chance to explain himself before the officer had cuffed him and accused him of, what? Murder? Assault? His breath caught in his throat as he replayed the officer's words in his mind. You probably killed him for his money. The accusation stung, like a slap to his face, and Jay could feel the weight of the injustice settling on his chest. His mind raced to find an answer, some explanation, some way out of this nightmare. But no matter how hard he thought, no answers came. How could this be happening? The patrol car's lights flashed as they sped through the streets, casting an eerie glow over the buildings and alleys that passed by. Jay tried to focus on the scenery outside, but everything felt distant, as if he were looking at the world through a foggy window. His body was physically present in the car, but his mind had drifted far away, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. The officers in the front didn't speak to him. Their silence was suffocating, a reminder that Jay was now an outsider, an anomaly, someone to be treated with suspicion. The second officer, who had arrived after the first one, barely glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face unreadable. The first officer, the one who had arrested Jay, kept his attention on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Jay wanted to scream, to shout that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he held his tongue. He knew that doing so would only make things worse. The officers had already made up their minds about him. What chance did he have against that kind of judgment? Minutes ticked by like hours. The tension in the car seemed to multiply with every passing second. Jay's hands were starting to ache from the handcuffs, and his body felt stiff from the lack of movement. He tried to shift slightly, but the cold metal cuffs dug deeper into his skin, reminding him of the reality he was now trapped in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car slowed and turned into a parking lot. Jay could see the dull, gray building in front of him, the police station. The thought of it made his stomach churn. He had never been inside a police station before, never imagined that he would be dragged there in handcuffs, accused of something he hadn't done. The car came to a stop, and the officer in the front seat shifted in his seat, glancing back at Jay for the first time since the arrest. His eyes were cold, his face set in a stern expression. "Stay quiet," the officer muttered, his voice low. "We'll sort this out inside." Jay nodded numbly, not trusting himself to speak. He didn't know what to say anymore. What could he say? He had done nothing wrong, but somehow he was still here. The officers climbed out of the car, and one of them, Jay couldn't tell which, opened the back door. Without a word, they pulled Jay out of the car and guided him toward the entrance of the station. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, his body still in shock from the events of the morning. His heart hammered in his chest, and he could feel the cold sweat on his brow. The officers walked briskly, their heavy boots echoing on the pavement, but Jay couldn't seem to make his feet move fast enough. The building loomed ahead, a fortress of cold stone and steel that seemed to grow larger with every step. They reached the entrance, and the officer held open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow over the room. Jay could feel his pulse quicken as they walked past the desks, where officers sat typing away at their computers or talking on the phone. The chatter and clatter of the station seemed like a distant noise, barely registering in Jay's mind as his world focused entirely on the cold, unfeeling walls around him. The officers led him down a hallway, past a series of doors, before stopping in front of one that was painted a dull shade of gray. One of the officers knocked sharply before opening the door. Jay stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was small, sparse, with only a metal table and 2 chairs. A single light hung overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. It smelled of stale air and old paperwork. Everything about the room felt sterile, impersonal, like a place meant for interrogation, not for someone like him. "Sit down," the officer commanded, his tone stern. Jay hesitated for only a moment before sitting in the chair across from the desk. His mind was racing. His hands were still cuffed, and the officer had not removed them. He couldn't stop thinking about the man, the one he had been trying to save. What was happening to him? Was he alive? Was he okay? Just as Jay opened his mouth to speak, the door opened again. A man in his 50s entered, his suit neatly pressed, his demeanor calm but authoritative. He looked down at Jay with sharp, calculating eyes before sitting at the desk across from him. The officer who had arrested Jay remained standing near the door, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. Jay opened his mouth again, his voice barely a whisper. "I swear, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help him." The man in the suit raised a hand, silencing Jay before he could say anything more. "We'll get to that in a moment," he said in a low, controlled voice. "First, let me ask you some questions." Jay nodded, his throat dry as the tension in the room intensified. The man in the suit studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Your name is Jay Williams, correct?" Jay nodded once more, his voice hoarse as he replied, "Yes, sir." "Do you live in the area?" "Yes." "Tell me what happened this morning," the man said, his voice steady, almost mechanical. "From the beginning." Jay took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to gather his thoughts. He knew he had to be careful with his words, but how could he explain something so absurd? How could he make them believe that he was just trying to help? "I was jogging, like I always do," Jay began, his voice cracking slightly. "I saw him lying in the middle of the road. I thought he was just asleep or something, but when I got closer, I saw he was having trouble breathing. He was choking, and I tried to help him. I gave him CPR, but it wasn't working. I don't know what happened after that." The man's eyes never left Jay's face. He didn't seem moved by Jay's words, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, skepticism, maybe? Disbelief? "Do you expect us to believe that?" The officer who had arrested Jay suddenly spoke up, his voice dripping with disdain. "A kid like you, out here, trying to save a man you don't know? That's a little hard to swallow, don't you think?" Jay's chest tightened at the officer's words. "I didn't hurt him," he said desperately. "I swear, I was just trying to help. Why would I hurt someone I don't even know?" The man in the suit leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "We'll see what the evidence says," he said coolly. Jay could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. They hadn't listened to him, and he could see that they weren't going to. The door clicked shut behind him, and Jay was left alone in the cold room, his mind spinning as he awaited whatever would come next. The unraveling truth. The air in the small interrogation room was thick with silence. Jay sat there, hands still cuffed behind his back, his mind a chaotic whirlpool of thoughts and emotions. He had tried to explain himself, but the officer had only sneered at his words, dismissing him as nothing more than a potential criminal. Jay felt helpless, trapped in a situation that he didn't know how to get out of. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the crushing realization that no one seemed to believe him. He had been raised in a world where people like him were often seen as threats, as outsiders, no matter their intentions. But he never thought that one day, he would become the very thing society feared, simply for trying to do the right thing. He had helped someone in need, and now he was being treated like a suspect. The seconds stretched into minutes, then hours. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. What was happening to the man he had tried to save? Was he alive? Did he survive the heart attack? Was Jay being blamed for the incident? And if so, why? Jay's body felt heavy with exhaustion, the weight of the handcuffs and the emotional strain taking their toll. He leaned forward in the chair, his legs stiff from sitting in one position for too long. His thoughts were scattered, but he clung to one hope, that someone, anyone, would come to his rescue, to prove that he was innocent and that he had only been trying to help. Just as Jay's mind was on the verge of spiraling into despair, the door to the interrogation room opened once more. The officer who had been silent during most of the questioning stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, but instead, he stood in the doorway, as though sizing up Jay for something. "Jay Williams, right?" the officer asked, his voice almost too calm. Jay nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had already said everything he could, and now he was just waiting for whatever came next. His heart pounded in his chest as he wondered what this new development might bring. The officer stepped forward, placing a file on the table between them. "We've reviewed the footage from the security cameras in the area," he said, his tone businesslike. "We also spoke to a few witnesses who were passing by at the time." Jay's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the evidence that would either clear him or condemn him. His breath quickened as he waited for the officer to continue. The officer didn't keep him in suspense for long. He opened the file, flipping through a few pages before he looked up at Jay, his eyes narrowing. "You're telling me that you were trying to save this man's life," the officer said slowly, his voice laced with skepticism. "But according to the footage and witnesses, we have a different story." Jay's stomach dropped. The room seemed to tilt around him as the officer's words echoed in his ears. "What do you mean?" Jay asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I was just helping him. I swear. I don't know what happened after that." The officer's eyes hardened. "According to the camera footage from the road, it shows you and the man interacting. But it doesn't show you performing CPR. In fact, it shows you kicking the man. And after that, you continue to stand over him, pacing back and forth, before the police arrived." Jay's mind went blank. Kicking him? The words didn't make sense. He didn't kick anyone. He had tried to save the man's life. He had pressed his hands into the man's chest, desperately trying to revive him, praying for any sign of life. What the officer was saying was impossible. No, that's not true," Jay stammered, shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't kick him. I was trying to help him. I did CPR. I don't know what you saw, but I didn't hurt him." The officer's gaze remained cold, unfazed by Jay's protests. "We'll see," he said, his voice flat. He stood up, closing the file with a sharp snap and turning toward the door. "We'll be back with more questions. And don't think your story is going to hold up in court." Jay's heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He was trapped in a web of lies and misunderstandings, and it felt as though there was no way out. How could the footage show him doing something he hadn't done? How had this all gone so horribly wrong? As the officer left the room, Jay slumped in his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cuffs on his wrists felt tighter now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. It wasn't just about the charges anymore, it was about the truth. The truth that no one seemed willing to believe. How could he prove his innocence when the evidence was being twisted against him? The door creaked open again, and this time, it wasn't the officer who entered. A young woman stepped inside, a detective, by the look of her. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail and a sharp, professional look about her. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and determination. "Jay Williams?" she asked, her voice softer than the officer's, but still authoritative. Jay nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes. I'm Detective Ramirez," she said, taking a seat at the table. She studied him for a moment, her eyes scanning his face as though trying to read him. After a beat, she spoke again. "I'm not here to interrogate you," she said quietly. "But I need you to tell me exactly what happened this morning. Everything. Don't leave anything out." Jay blinked, surprised by the change in tone. Unlike the other officers, Detective Ramirez didn't seem to be judging him outright. There was something almost compassionate in her eyes, a hint of empathy that Jay hadn't felt from anyone else. She was different, and in that moment, he felt a small spark of hope. "I was just jogging, like I always do," Jay began, his voice trembling but more steady than before. "I saw this man lying in the middle of the road. I thought he was asleep or maybe hurt, but when I got closer, I saw he was having trouble breathing. I tried to help him. I did CPR, but it wasn't working. I didn't know what else to do. And then the cops came. They didn't listen to me. They just arrested me." Detective Ramirez listened without interrupting, her gaze steady as Jay spoke. When he finished, she sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath. "You're telling me you didn't hurt him?" she asked, her voice calm but searching. "I didn't," Jay said urgently, his chest tightening as he spoke. "I was just trying to save him. I don't know what the footage shows, but I didn't kick him. I didn't do anything wrong." Detective Ramirez studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any signs of deceit. But after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slightly. "I believe you," she said quietly. "I think there's more to this than what the footage shows. But we're going to need to figure out what really happened." Jay could barely process her words. Someone believed him. For the first time since the moment he had been arrested, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The search for truth. The next few hours were a blur of questioning, paperwork, and intense pressure. Despite Detective Ramirez's brief moment of belief, Jay couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were stacked against him. The station's sterile, fluorescent-lit halls felt like a maze, one he couldn't find his way out of. Every corner seemed to echo with the whisper of his own doubts. How could they think I'm guilty of something I didn't do? Jay's mind spun in circles as the weight of the charges he might be facing threatened to crush him. The young detective had left him alone in the small interrogation room, promising to get back to him soon, but Jay couldn't understand what that meant. Was she working with the same officers who had arrested him, the ones who had accused him of assaulting the unconscious man? Or was she genuinely trying to find the truth? He leaned back in the chair, shifting uncomfortably as his wrists ached from the cuffs still pinning his hands behind his back. Jay had lost track of time. It felt like hours had passed since he last saw Ramirez. He had no idea what was happening outside the room, what the other officers were doing, or what his family might be thinking. His phone had been taken, and he had no way of reaching out to anyone. He wondered if they even knew where he was. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and now everything was spinning out of control. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Detective Ramirez reappeared. She had a stack of papers in her hand, and she looked weary but determined. There was something different in her eyes now. A sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Jay, we've been looking over the evidence more carefully," she began, sitting down across from him. Her voice was quieter, more intense, and Jay instinctively leaned forward, his heart pounding in anticipation. She placed the papers on the table, sliding them toward him. "These are the results of the further investigation we did into the scene," she said. "We've been checking the footage and talking to more witnesses. It's clear that something doesn't add up with what we first saw." Jay's breath caught in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. Ramirez met his gaze, her expression serious but not hostile. "We've reviewed the security footage again. This time, we looked at it frame by frame. The first officer misinterpreted what was happening. It wasn't you kicking the man. It looks like you were trying to perform chest compressions, but there's a moment when the man's body jerks. His arms flailed, possibly due to the stress on his heart. It's easy to misinterpret in that kind of chaotic situation." Jay felt the air leave his lungs as his body tensed, his mind desperately trying to process what the detective had just said. "It wasn't me?" "So, you're saying it wasn't me?" Jay asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though saying it out loud would make it more real. Detective Ramirez nodded slowly. That's right. But we still don't know exactly what happened, Jay. What we do know is that this man, he's still alive. He was taken to the hospital after you called for help. Jay's heart seemed to stop beating. He's alive? His voice cracked with disbelief. Ramirez gave him a small, reassuring smile. Yes, and the doctors are working on stabilizing him. He's in critical condition, but it looks like there's a chance he'll pull through. For a moment, Jay couldn't speak. The weight that had been pressing on his chest seemed to lift, just slightly, at the news. The man he had tried so desperately to save was still alive. That was all that mattered now. He was alive. But we're not out of the woods yet, Ramirez continued, her tone becoming more serious. We've got to figure out what happened with the man's collapse. The doctors have ruled out foul play for now, but we need to figure out if there was something else going on, something that could explain his condition. Jay nodded, feeling a sense of relief mixed with growing anxiety. If the man had collapsed from a heart attack, Jay needed to know why. Was it natural? Was there something more sinister behind it? Was Jay involved somehow? Ramirez leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but urgent. I know this is difficult, Jay, but I need to ask you some more questions. The footage shows that you were alone when you found the man. But we've also spoken to a few people who claim they saw you interact with the man earlier that morning. Did you have any prior contact with him before you saw him collapsed in the road? Jay shook his head vigorously. No. I swear. I didn't know him at all. I've never seen him before in my life. I was just out jogging. I don't know why he was there, but when I saw him, I had to help him. I didn't know what was wrong with him. Ramirez studied him carefully, her eyes searching his face. There was a pause before she spoke again, her voice filled with caution. There are also some inconsistencies with what the officers said. The second officer who arrived on the scene, the one who helped arrest you, he said he saw you fleeing the scene before they got there. Is that true? Jay's eyes widened. No, he shouted, his voice sharp. I didn't flee. I was just trying to help him. I stayed with him the whole time, waiting for the ambulance to get there. Ramirez nodded slowly, but her eyes darkened. We're still investigating that part. We've talked to a few witnesses who were passing by, and some of them say they didn't see you leaving. But we're trying to corroborate the information. If someone tried to accuse you of fleeing the scene, it could be a misunderstanding. But we need more details before we can make any conclusions. Jay's mind reeled at the possibility. Someone had said he'd fled? Why would anyone think that? He had stayed there, waiting for help, trying everything he could to save the man. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. The pieces of the story didn't fit together. Detective Ramirez continued, I know this isn't easy, Jay, but I'm going to need you to stay with me. We're going to find out what happened, and we'll make sure the truth comes out. But I need your help. I need you to tell me everything you can remember from that morning. Even the smallest details could make a difference. Jay nodded, his voice trembling but determined. I'll tell you everything. I don't want anyone to think I did anything wrong. I didn't hurt him. I was just trying to help. Ramirez gave him a slight smile, though it was laced with exhaustion. I believe you, Jay. Now, let's get to the bottom of this. We're not done yet. As Ramirez stood to leave, Jay couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he had anticipated. The more he learned, the more he realized that the truth was elusive, tangled up in layers of confusion and misinterpretation. There were still so many questions. What had caused the man's collapse? Why was he even out there in the first place? And why were so many people so quick to turn on Jay? The answers were still out of reach, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Jay had a small sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as guilty as they made him out to be. Maybe the truth would set him free. But one thing was certain, this wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. The road ahead was long, and Jay was about to find out just how much further he would have to go to clear his name and uncover the real story behind the man's collapse. The tension builds. The days following Jay's questioning were a blur of uncertainty. Detective Ramirez had promised to keep him updated, but the silence that followed was deafening. He sat in the small, stark room at the station, his hands still bound by the cold handcuffs, and the tension in his chest only seemed to grow with each passing hour. Jay's mind swirled with questions that had no answers. He couldn't stop thinking about the man he had tried to save, the man who was now clinging to life in the hospital. What had really happened to him? What was the truth? Jay spent those endless hours replaying the events in his head. He remembered seeing the man on the road, the man who had looked so out of place in his expensive suit, and the panic that had gripped him when he realized the man wasn't just passed out, he was dying. Jay had done everything he could to help, but somehow it hadn't been enough. The man had collapsed again, and the officers had arrived, accusing Jay of something he couldn't even comprehend. Each time he tried to make sense of it, his mind became more tangled in confusion. The footage showed something completely different from what he remembered. How had they misinterpreted it so badly? The evidence seemed stacked against him, but Detective Ramirez had said she believed him. That single piece of reassurance was the only thing keeping Jay from falling apart entirely. As the days dragged on, Jay was moved from one holding cell to another, the quiet of his small space only broken by the muffled sounds of the station around him. Every moment felt like an eternity, and each minute felt like a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate him. His world had become a blur of sterile rooms, harsh lights, and the smell of sweat and disinfectant. He could barely remember what it was like to run in the early morning light, to feel the cool breeze against his skin, and to leave behind the weight of his family's struggles. His thoughts were consumed by one thing now, proving that he was innocent. On the fourth day, after what felt like an endless cycle of questioning and legal procedures, Detective Ramirez finally came to see him again. This time, she was accompanied by a man in a suit, someone Jay didn't recognize. The man looked serious, his eyes sharp behind dark-rimmed glasses, and his posture was that of someone who was accustomed to being in control. "Jay," Ramirez said as she sat down in front of him, her expression more tense than before. "We've been working on your case. I have some news for you." Jay could feel the weight of the words she was about to say before she even spoke them. He looked at her, his throat tight, barely able to breathe as she continued. "We've found something," Ramirez said, her voice low. "The man you tried to help, he's not who he seemed to be. His name is David Sinclair. He's not some random stranger. We did some digging, and it turns out he's a high-profile businessman. He's been linked to some very controversial deals, including some questionable business practices." Jay's mind raced as he tried to absorb what she was saying. High-profile businessmen? It felt like a different world, a world he knew nothing about. "Wait," Jay interrupted, his voice rough. "You mean I helped this guy? He's a big businessman?" Ramirez nodded. "Yes, and that's not all. We've also uncovered that there were witnesses who saw him interacting with someone before he collapsed. He wasn't alone on the road." Jay's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who else was with him? Why didn't anyone tell me about that?" "Exactly," the man in the suit spoke up for the first time, his voice smooth but unsettling. "That's what we need to understand. There are conflicting reports about who was with him when he collapsed. Some witnesses saw a woman with him. But others claim there was a man there, too, a person who seemed to be arguing with Mr. Sinclair. We're still piecing together the details." Jay leaned forward in his chair, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. "A woman? A man arguing with him? It all seemed so far out of reach, so strange. He had only seen the man on the road, hadn't even gotten a chance to ask who he was before the man collapsed. The idea that there were others involved, people who might have had something to do with what had happened, made Jay's stomach churn. "Detective, are you telling me that someone else was involved? That someone made him collapse?" Jay asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. "We don't know yet, Jay," Ramirez replied. "But we're working to uncover what really happened. The more we dig into this, the clearer it becomes that there's more to this than meets the eye. This might not have been an accidental collapse." Jay ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What was happening? How had he ended up in the middle of all this? One moment, he was just a teenager trying to do the right thing, and now he was entangled in a web of lies, mystery, and danger. Is there any chance he's connected to something criminal? Jay asked, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper. Detective Ramirez hesitated before answering. It's too early to say. But there are suspicions. We're investigating further. The man in the suit, who had remained silent up until now, cleared his throat. We've also had a chance to review the financial records related to Sinclair's business dealings. We found some strange transactions, money being funneled into unknown accounts, and some of it linked to individuals with shady reputations. We need to figure out what's going on here, but we don't have all the pieces yet. Jay felt a cold chill spread through his body. Shady reputations? Could Sinclair have been involved in something dangerous? Was he in trouble because of some business deal gone wrong? You're telling me I might be in trouble because I tried to help a man who's involved in something illegal? Jay's voice was filled with incredulity. I didn't know anything about this. I just found him on the road and did what anyone would have done. We know that, Jay, Ramirez said, her voice filled with sympathy. You're not being accused of anything related to his business. What we need to figure out now is how this man ended up there, and if anyone was involved in his collapse. If we can prove that someone else was responsible, we can clear your name completely. The weight of her words sank in, but Jay still had so many questions. Why had Sinclair been on that road? Was he being targeted by someone? And if so, what did this mean for Jay? Was he going to get caught up in a scandal he had nothing to do with? Where does this leave me? Jay asked, his voice growing heavy. Am I free to go? Ramirez looked at him for a long moment before answering. Not yet. But we're working on getting you released. We just need a little more time to gather the information we need. In the meantime, we're going to make sure no one puts the blame on you for something you didn't do. Jay felt a strange mix of hope and fear. For the first time in days, he could see a way out. But the uncertainty still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. There were too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns, and too many people involved. As Ramirez and the man in the suit stood up to leave, she placed a hand on Jay's shoulder, her expression serious but compassionate. Hang in there, Jay. We're getting closer to the truth. I promise you. But even as he nodded in agreement, Jay couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much darker and more complicated than he could ever have imagined. The breaking point. The air in the station seemed heavier now, thick with unspoken tensions and unanswered questions. Jay sat back in the small, uncomfortable chair, his hands finally uncuffed but still sore from days of restraint. Detective Ramirez's words echoed in his mind as he stared at the door, waiting for some sort of confirmation, some sign that he was finally free from the grip of this nightmare. But nothing came. Days turned into nights, and the only thing that seemed certain was the relentless feeling of uncertainty pressing down on him. He had been moved from the interrogation room to a holding cell, a grim place that smelled of sweat and old coffee, where the hum of fluorescent lights was constant, and the occasional clang of metal doors served as a reminder of how trapped he truly felt. He was alone now, or so it seemed. The bustling noise of the police station outside the walls of his cell was muffled, a distant hum of activity. But it was all a blur to him now. His mind, once sharp and clear, felt clouded, as though he were drifting through a fog of confusion. For a brief moment, Jay allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe deeply, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. The man's name is David Sinclair. He's a businessman with connections to shady characters. Maybe this wasn't just an accident after all. Jay's head swam with fragments of what he had learned. Sinclair was involved in financial dealings, and possibly criminal activities, but how did this tie into Jay's involvement? He still didn't understand how he had become part of this complicated web. It felt surreal to think that a single act of kindness, trying to save a man's life, could spiral into such a mess. He had never asked for any of this. He wasn't involved in any illegal dealings or business conspiracies. Jay just wanted to help, yet now he found himself stuck in a world of crime, corruption, and manipulation, none of which he had any control over. Just then, the door to his cell opened with a loud squeak, and Jay looked up to see Detective Ramirez step inside. Her face was weary, and there was an unmistakable tension in her posture, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. She glanced at him with a mixture of sympathy and determination before speaking. "Jay, we need to talk," she said softly. He stood up, suddenly alert. "What's going on? Has the man I helped, Sinclair, is he?" Jay's voice cracked, the words stuck in his throat as the reality of the situation hit him. Was Sinclair alive? Had he recovered? Was Jay about to learn the truth? Ramirez held up her hand, signaling him to wait. "I'm sorry to say this, but Sinclair didn't make it." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle between them. "He passed away a few hours ago." Jay felt his legs buckle beneath him, and he had to grip the bars of the cell to steady himself. Sinclair was dead. The man he had tried so desperately to save, the man who had collapsed before him, he was gone. The shock of it hit Jay harder than he expected. His mind reeled with disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Sinclair was supposed to survive, to be taken to a hospital where doctors could save him. But now, he was dead, and Jay was left with nothing but the devastating consequences of the situation. There was no way to take back what had happened. There was no way to undo his involvement. "I'm sorry, Jay," Ramirez said, her voice tinged with regret. "I know you didn't want this. I know you didn't cause it. But now we need to figure out what really happened, and that's going to take time." Jay sank back down onto the bench in his cell, his mind spinning. What does this mean for me? He had been trying to help, but now, with Sinclair's death, his role in this twisted story had become infinitely more complicated. Would he be charged with manslaughter? Could they prove that he wasn't involved in whatever led to the man's collapse? The weight of uncertainty pressed on him like a vice. "Detective, you've got to believe me," Jay pleaded, his voice breaking. "I didn't hurt him. I just tried to help. I swear." Ramirez nodded, her face filled with a mixture of frustration and empathy. "I know, Jay. But now, there are bigger questions. The witnesses we spoke to, they're starting to change their stories. Some of them are telling us there were people near the scene who might have seen what happened before you got there. They're claiming that Sinclair was with a woman, someone who looked like she was in a hurry to leave the area after the collapse." Jay's heart raced. A woman? This was the first he was hearing of this. Was she the cause of Sinclair's collapse? Did she know something about his business dealings that he hadn't been told? And why had no one mentioned her before? Did anyone say who she was? Jay asked, his mind working overtime. What did she look like? We don't have a clear description yet, Ramirez replied. But there's something else. We've been trying to get more information on Sinclair's background. It turns out that his recent business deals were connected to people who've been under investigation for a long time. Some of them are known for being involved in questionable, even dangerous activities. This might be bigger than we thought. Jay felt a sickening twist in his gut. Dangerous activities? What had he gotten himself into? He was just a kid, a teenager with dreams of escaping the suffocating life in his neighborhood. Now, he was being dragged into a world of corruption, deceit, and possibly violence. Are you telling me I'm involved with people like that? Jay asked, his voice trembling with fear. Ramirez shook her head. No, Jay. I'm not saying you're involved. But we need to be careful. Whoever Sinclair was mixed up with, they're not people to mess with. We need to find out who that woman was and what happened that day. You need to stay sharp, stay patient. If you keep your story straight, you'll be okay. Jay felt a strange sense of relief at Ramirez's words. She was trying to protect him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like someone on the outside believed in his innocence. But the relief was fleeting, replaced by the gnawing realization that the truth, whatever it was, had become more elusive than ever. As Ramirez turned to leave, she paused by the door. One last thing, Jay. We've learned that Sinclair was being followed by someone, a private investigator, possibly. The person was tracking his movements in the days leading up to his collapse. We're working on tracing the investigator's trail, but it's going to take time. We need to know what Sinclair was involved in before his death. But whatever happens, you need to stay out of trouble. Don't go anywhere. Stay in touch with me. Jay nodded, the weight of everything crashing down on him. A private investigator? This whole situation was like a puzzle, each new piece making it harder to see the whole picture. He couldn't afford to be reckless now. Not when so much was on the line. As Ramirez left the cell, Jay leaned back against the cold wall, trying to process everything. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of deception and lies, and somehow, Jay had to find it, before it was too late. The walls of the station felt like they were closing in on him. Every second spent in this cell was another moment he couldn't get back. But there was no choice. Jay was stuck, trapped by the same uncertainty that had haunted him since the moment he found Sinclair on the road. And now, with Sinclair's death, the stakes had risen. If Jay didn't find the truth, if he didn't prove his innocence, he would be caught in the wake of something much bigger than he could imagine.